Well, hello and welcome back to Cincy Reformed Podcast. My name is Zach Wise. I'm here with my friend and co-pastor, Brandon Burks. And we're here today to talk a little bit about Catechesis with Brandon. It's might be news for you, but we're going to actually hold a conference this fall called Nurture, and with the tagline saying, "The world is prepared to teach your children. Are you?" And so at this conference, we're hoping to encourage and to help equip parents to take very seriously the role of raising children in the fear and admonition of the Lord in terms of overseeing their spiritual formation, their education, and to help them to become mature Christians. And we're going to be having 3 talks. One of those talks is going to be coming from none other than Pastor Brandon. And so today we're going to get a bit of a sneak peek of what we can expect to hear from him later, hopefully whet your appetite a little bit. So Brandon, as we kind of get started here, I've used that word catechism or catechesis. Could you talk a little bit about that word, where it's from, maybe some surrounding words? Because I'm guessing that some people that are listening right now and viewing right now might think that we're talking about something Roman Catholic. But could you help sketch out those terms for us a little bit?
Yeah, so the word catechism, catechesis, is coming from a Greek word, katecheo. And the Greek word means to teach, means to instruct. It can mean to echo, with the expectation that you'll get a sound back, almost kind of like sonar, for example. A submarine might send out a sonar ping, like an echo, and want to receive something back. And so you kind of get that idea with catechism, catechesis, that a teacher is going to ask a question and then expect a desired answer back. And that word, katecheo, is a Bible word. It's not a word that was, made up by the Roman Catholic Church or something like that. It's a word that comes from the Bible. We see it throughout Scripture. For example, in Galatians 6:6, you could translate that verse to say, "Let the catechumen share all good things with the catechist." And so, again, I used some more words there that maybe our listeners not familiar with. So catechumen, catechist, these are all words that derive from that Greek word, katecheo. Catechumen simply means pupil, somebody who is learning, someone who is under instruction. A catechist is a teacher, somebody who teaches. A catechism is the content of the teaching. Maybe it's a book that you're using. It is the content. For example, the Heidelberg Catechism would be the content that you're going to teach. Catechesis is the practice of teaching, instructing someone in the Christian faith. Throughout church history, there was something called the catechumenate. And that basically means the schoolhouse, or the period of instruction that is given somebody who might want to join the church. They might have to spend time in the catechumenate before they are brought on to church membership. There's also the word catechetics, and that refers to the art or the science of catechizing someone. And so all those different words kind of deriving from that one Greek word, katecheo, if that's helpful.
I think it is, and I think it might be helpful now to reflect and maybe help explain to our listeners why it might be helpful for them to recover, for all of us to recover this kind of language and way of thought. And maybe you can root this for us a little bit in the history of the church and how our Christian forefathers have found these concepts to be helpful, maybe how they applied some of these concepts, just to help us think outside of our Western 21st century narrow view of things. But why might a recovery of some of these practices, as we reflect upon the church, why might that be helpful?
Yeah, so I think that there's a few reasons given, and I'll probably give some more in the talk that I'm going to give at the conference. But I think one of the big reasons that it's helpful to recover some of this, and even some of the language, I think, helps us in our Western context when we think about, discipleship or something like that. When we think about giving instruction, sometimes we're only thinking about passing down information, where in the early church, the catechumenate was really more holistic, where it had head, heart, and hands in view. It had the whole body in view. It was not only shaping what you know, shaping your mind, but it was also about shaping your life. It was about shaping a piety. It was about forming someone. It was about, and I think it's... this language was used, for example, by Saint Chrysostom, where he would speak about shaping children, or shaping a catechumen was like an artist sculpting, and that was kind of the imagery behind catechizing, was you are forming, shaping not only what they know, but their piety, their devotion, their heart devotion, their lives, their prayer lives, and so on. And throughout the history of the church, we've seen catechizing as something that was done. Now, it wasn't done universal throughout the history of the church, and actually you can tell when catechizing waned in the church. When catechizing waned in the church, darkness happened. It was a bad thing when the church stopped catechizing people. But you can see throughout the church places and times and seasons where catechizing was really something that was focused on and prized. Again, being rooted in the Bible, all the way back even in Deuteronomy 6, where God is telling parents, whether you're walking, whether you're sitting, whether you're lying down, whatever you're doing, take opportunities to teach children His Word. That mandate to instruct children was not only for the Old Testament, but we see it throughout the New Testament. In Ephesians chapter 6, where fathers are to instruct children in the ways of the Lord. And the Bible takes, I think, very seriously the passing down the information from one generation to the next generation. And we see what happens when that doesn't happen. For example, in Judges 2:10, there was a whole generation who grew up that did not know the Lord or the things that He had done for Israel. And that is, I think, pretty astounding that in Judges 2:10, an entire generation arose. And it shows you, I think, how quickly things can be lost, how quickly a generation can go wayward when the church stops catechizing, when the church stops passing down that instruction. And it's amazing, even as you're reading through the Bible, starting in Genesis, and all of a sudden you get to Judges, all the things that God had done for Israel. I mean, all the things that had happened, the Exodus that had happened, the wilderness wanderings. I mean, just the whole thing. Abraham and the patriarchs and a whole generation came about, didn't know God. Who's God? Didn't know what He had done. What is the Exodus? What is this redemption? And they had no concepts because the faith was not faithfully passed down. And the same thing throughout church history. As the gospel was going forward into more pagan territories, especially where the gap between the church and the culture was more massive. There arose the catechumenate, that kind of instruction ground, where as they were talking to people who used to believe in many gods, pantheons of gods, and maybe was involved with some of the more cultic practices in pagan temples where there was sexual immorality and things. They're evangelizing, bringing them into the church, but they would go through a season of the catechumenate, and they took the catechumenate very seriously. They wanted to not only pass down the faith in terms of information, but to form people into that faith. Early on, they would call Christianity the way. And it was not only something that you obviously had to know, but it was a walk. It was a path. It was a piety and a way of life and a way of thought and a way of speaking and doing. It just impacted your whole life. Whereas I think in our modern context, we can almost compartmentalize too much, where we only give information, or we only do this, and we have one class for this and one class for this other thing. And I think even as you're reading the Apostle Paul's letters, you see how holistic he viewed these things. Even in the book of Ephesians, for example, he begins the book of Ephesians with some pretty complex theology. In the Greek, he's using very large and long sentences. He's unpacking very heady, weighty things, talking about you were chosen in Christ before the foundation of the world, predestined in love. And then he can flow from a doctrinal treatise almost into just seamlessly, husbands, love your wives, children, obey your parents, spiritual warfare. And so he practice and head, heart, hands, all very holistic there. And I think that's how it was in the early church as they're trying to form people and shape people. Catechizing in the early church really had a focus on the Lord's Prayer and the Apostles' Creed. Those were the two big rubrics that they wanted to really form and shape and pass down to younger Christians and the next generation of Christians. And so when you would catechize in that context, you would often unpack and walk through line by line the Apostles' Creed and explain line by line the Apostles' Creed. And then you'd walk through the Lord's Prayer, petition by petition, and really develop what is being asked. What is this telling us about God? What is this telling us about ourselves? And so it wasn't just something that was recited very fast, but it was something that was studied line by line through the Apostles' Creed, through the Lord's Prayer. They would also do the Ten Commandments, but the Ten Commandments didn't come into, I think, specific view until the medieval period. In the medieval period, it really became clear that there were three rubrics: the Apostles' Creed, the Ten Commandments, and the Lord's Prayer. And those were the three rubrics that you would really use to shape the catechumen. The catechisms that were written during the early church and the medieval church were often pretty lengthy, book length. They sometimes were sermons, and it really wasn't short, pithy Q&A. So, for example, in our day, we are used to more pithy, short question-answer kind of catechism. So, for example, if you've memorized the Westminster Shorter Catechism, you might have that very first question: what is the chief end of man? And so the catechist would ask the catechumen, what is the chief end of man? And the catechumen would say the chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. And so we're kind of used to that short, pithy, question and answer type of catechism in our modern context. But early on in the early church and in the medieval church, they did not have the short, pithy Q&A kind of catechism. In fact, the very first Q&A catechism was written by Bruno of Würzburg in the medieval period. He was the very first one to actually write a short, pithy Q&A catechism. And that was, again, picked up, I think, by Martin Luther. And Luther's catechism, his shorter catechism he wrote during the Reformation, was just a fantastic catechism that walked through the three rubrics. It walked through the Apostles' Creed, it walked through the Ten Commandments, it walked through the Lord's Prayer, and he also added a section on the sacraments as well. And then being picked up in the Reformed tradition as well, with Calvin's the Genevan Catechism, the Heidelberg Catechism, and eventually into the Westminster Catechism as well. So throughout the history of the church, Christians have wanted to pass down the faith, and they would do it through catechisms that often walk through the three basic rubrics of the Christian faith: Apostles' Creed, Ten Commandments, Lord's Prayer. Also talk about the Catechism. In the Reformation period, it was especially something that was really emphasized because they were coming out of a season where the church stopped catechizing. In fact, I think it was J.I. Packer who said the Reformation happened because catechesis stopped. And so as Luther and as Calvin are writing and teaching, they are very diligent to want to catechize. In fact, John Calvin said, the church will not survive without a catechism. We have to have a catechism. Martin Luther, he had a view of catechesis that was not only for the children and for the new converts, but it was for the Christian throughout their entire life. Mm-hmm. In fact, it was interesting. So Martin Luther wrote the Catechism, and then he made the comment, he said, I'm always going to be a student of the Catechism. The Catechism that he wrote, he said, I'll never master it, but every day I'm going to study the Catechism afresh like a child, and I'm going to grow, and I'll never move on from the basics. I'm going to grow in the basics. And throughout the Puritans as well, Thomas Watson, he speaks about how if all you do is preach and you don't catechize, it's like you're building without a foundation. The catechesis has to be in place in order for the church to propagate well, to be healthy, to be vibrant, to make sure that Judges 2:10 kind of thing doesn't happen. So hopefully that was kind of a helpful historical sketch there.
Yeah, it certainly is, and I think it should be obvious to our listener by this point that there is just a wealth within the history of the church that is available for us if only we would be interested in it and to utilize it. And I think it's also been clear from what you're describing here that this task of catechesis is really interrelated with the idea of Christian discipleship. Sure. I've heard plenty of times where people have spoken about, discipleship is really following after Jesus, and it's this life that's modeled after Jesus. And I think that's really what you're getting at in a lot of ways. It's not just information, but there needs to be information, right? Yeah. Which then creates a life of piety, a life of that honors God, that glorifies God, and enjoys Him forever. And I'm wondering now, as we start thinking about this, obviously some of what you said was the church doing the catechesis and being part of the catechetical process. Mm-hmm. But you also were mentioning things that the parents can do. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering maybe if you can give a sneak peek to the parents about, you'll get into this more later, but why might it be helpful for them to begin to think about catechizing their children? Is there some biblical encouragement for this? What kind of encouragement would you have for children or for the parents in terms of why this is a helpful way for parents to disciple their children?
Yeah, so I think that the Bible gives us many motivations for why we would, as parents, want to catechize our children. So, for example, me and my children at home, we are working through the Heidelberg Catechism. I want them to memorize the entire Heidelberg Catechism. And I think the Bible gives us some motivations for wanting that. One is just the fall. Genesis chapter 3. We live in a sin-cursed world where people are fallen, we are sinful. Sin has affected our whole being, our minds, our emotions, our wills. And so because of the fall, I want to put good information into my children. Spiritual saving truths are not something we're born with. They have to be put into us before we can have them. And so because of the fall, I want to put those spiritual saving truths into my children because it's not there naturally. If they're going to think about these things, it has to be in there to think about. And they are at the right age where, their minds are like sponges. They soak, these things up. And so let them soak up good things to think about in their minds. A second motivation, and it's something that one of my old professors, G.K. Beale, something that he would talk about a lot in his biblical theology. He's written a lot about the book of Revelation, about the book of Daniel, and he has shown that this figure that the book of Revelation calls the beast. Obviously, being spoken about in Daniel and other places. But one of the tasks of the beast is to sow false teaching. That's one of the big emphases is false teaching, darkness being spread, false ideas being spread. And so I think that creates a context for us to think about. We are entering. We are in a world, we are in a church in which the evil one, the beast, is wanting to sow false ideas. And there's going to be deception. And Satan is going to masquerade as an angel of light. And there's going to be heresy and heterodoxy. And I think that creates a motivation for sound doctrine then. I want my children really embedded in sound doctrine. If one of the prerogatives of the beast is to sow false doctrine, not just with outside of the church, but inside the church. And so that is going to be a challenge that my children are going to face, is the beast sowing false teaching. And so I think that creates kind of a second thing, that there's going to be heterodoxy. And so I want them to be able to, Titus 1:9, exhort in sound doctrine, refute those who contradict it. To know the good so much that they can see whenever there's a deviation. Obviously, Titus 1:9 is speaking about pastors, but that's something that I think all Christians should aspire to do, is being able to understand the gospel well enough to detect deviations. I think a third motivation that the Scripture gives us, again from the book of Revelation, is you were introduced to this great harlot. And the great harlot is kind of the world trying to seduce us. The world trying to woo us away from Christ. The world trying to show us how, all of the dainties that the world has, trying to get us to be not satisfied or unsatisfied with Christ, to where we would be like Demas and leave Christ for the world. And so they're entering a context. In fact, they're born into a context where there is a clash. There is war, you could say, in a very real sense. A clash between the Genesis 3:15, the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. There's this ongoing clash until Christ comes back. And so they're entering spiritual combat where we're fallen, we're in a fallen world, and our hearts are deceptive. The evil one is sowing, and his beast, they are sowing false doctrine and false teaching and bad ideas that might sound plausible on the surface, and come to find out they're heresy. I mean, even as the evil one was tempting Jesus, he's quoting the Bible. Heretics throughout the history of the church were usually not those people who said, I don't believe the Bible. They were typically people who said, I only believe the Bible. Arius said, I just believe the Bible and whatever the Bible says. And so we need to train people who can detect deviation from sound teaching. And also for our children to withstand what John Bunyan in the Pilgrim's Progress calls Vanity Fair. This world that's trying to seduce us away from Christ, to woo us away from Christ. And so we, in a very real sense, we are training soldiers of the cross who are going into combat. And as much as we want to protect our children and shelter our children and keep them away from anything bad and anything evil, there's a very real sense in which we can't do that. We can't protect our children every time they fall. We can't protect our children from all the abuses and nasty things that are out there in the world. And we are training soldiers of the cross to go forth into combat. And we want to give them the greatest tools that we can. And I think as we understand our context, I think it makes catechizing so vital and so important. And oftentimes we as Christian parents, sometimes we forget where we are. We think maybe we're already in Mount Zion, and we're already in Beulah land and paradise, and we just have a very lackadaisical, I'm just gonna go along with everything else and hope for the best. And we forget that we are in the trenches, and we are in the valleys, and we are in the wilderness. And we forget these things. We forget our context. We forget the war that is happening around us. We forget the beast who is actively, constantly within the church sowing false doctrine. We forget the harlot who is there every time I turn on the television. We just forget our context. And when we are aware of our context, then I think that we will be very motivated to catechize our children, to shape them as soldiers of the cross. And also as James K.A. Smith talks about how when we go to the mall, when we go to the world, wherever we are, there are secular liturgies that are trying to shape us. And if we're not aware of it, we will be shaped by secular liturgies. The great harlot has a liturgy that she wants to shape each and every one of us into. And so there are competing liturgies. There's Christ-shaped liturgies and harlot-shaped liturgies, and we're going to be shaped by one of those. You're not going to be neutral here. And all of us are going to be ravaged to some degree at some point or another by some of the harlots' liturgies that are out there in the world. And so we want to give our children the armor and the tools that we can and send them out into battle to fight.
So for Brandon, and I think as you can tell, and as I know quite well, this is something that means a lot to Brandon. He's not only a father and a pastor, but he is very interested in exploring these things in a very significant depth. So I'm going to maybe just give the listener a little bit of a sneak peek into your own level or your own interest in this topic, and what's gotten you into this, and where do you hope to go with it?
Yeah, so I grew up Roman Catholic and was not catechized as a Catholic. I came to faith later in life. I was in my early to mid-20s. Serving in the Navy, and heard the gospel, joined a church, read the Bible for the first time, got really excited about these things, went off to Bible college, and while I was in Bible college, I heard about this thing called Catechism. And one of my professors actually turned the Catechism into music. And so I just driving to school and back each week, I would listen to the Catechism that was set to music, and I think within like a month I had the whole thing memorized, and just seeing the benefits of it, I was like, wow, like this Catechism is so rich. This Catechism is historically rooted, and it's so practical. Like, it's helping me think, it's helping me teach, it's helping me to have a ready answer. When someone asks me, what is justification? Justification is an act of God's free grace whereby God pardons us of all of our sins and accepts us as righteous in His sight, but only for the righteousness of Christ imputed to us and received by faith alone. Like, it was just nice to have a ready answer for questions that come about, and to have that on the tip of my tongue, and also to think about things, all these truths that are being stored into our minds. And so I think I first became attracted to catechesis and catechisms by just seeing the great benefit in my own life. And then as I was having children, really wanting to pass down the Christian faith and getting interested in that. And then also on the how-to side, that's been something that I've been kind of really getting interested in and wanting to kind of explore more of how to best catechize. How can we pass down the Christian faith? And so even in not only studying catechesis and catechisms historically, but also more practically, the practice of, the art of catechizing has been something that I've taken interest to. Actually wrote a catechism. It was a Reformed Baptist catechism back when I was a Baptist. Hopefully here in the next coming years I can write a new edition to that. But in that book I have an introduction in the catechism where I talk about some ways in which parents could catechize, or some methods of doing so. And those were just methods that I was trying to develop as my children were growing. So as I had a 4-year-old, I'm trying to catechize who doesn't read. So I can't write it out on a board. So it became very evident that repetition. And so I had kind of a 5-step process of how I would catechize a 4-year-old who doesn't read, or is just starting to kind of learn the basics of reading. How I would just kind of, through repetition, through hearing it over and over and over again, how they could kind of memorize it and take it in and soak it up. And then as my children became readers, putting it out on a board, erasing a word, seeing if they could get it, erasing another word, seeing if they could get it, until the whole board was blank and we could still recite it. Recently we've tried diagrams, kind of theological diagrams on a chalkboard, where you can kind of see it mapped out, whatever truth that you're talking about. So I've been trying to help parents think through how best to do it, and I'm really convinced that the younger the better. Like their minds are of an age where they retain information better. They learn differently than adults do. For me to memorize things, like right now I'm trying to memorize the entire Heidelberg Catechism, and I'm having more difficulty than my 4-year-old and 7-year-old are having. They can get it very quickly, whereas I get it and then half an hour later it's gone. I have to try to get it back all over again. So our children just memorize things, learn things differently. And some parents say, well, should I get a very basic child's one that maybe just has a few words in it? And I think that there's a place for those. They can be helpful, but at the same time, we have to kind of be practical about these things. Is it realistic that your child will memorize 2 catechisms in their life? Will they memorize kind of the baby kids catechism and then all of a sudden finish that, move on and restart a new catechism and memorize the adult catechism? Well, in my experience talking with people, that's not been the case. They've memorized one, the child's catechism, and then they've not gone on to memorize any others. And so you have to ask yourself, what is going to be sufficient for the child as they grow throughout their life? And it's okay to teach above a child's understanding. As you read all of the catechists throughout the history of the church, they all say it is okay if a child does not fully grasp what they're memorizing. Get it in their brain, and as they grow up, they'll have light bulb kind of experiences where they're saying, aha, that's what that meant. That's what I memorized. But guess what? It's already memorized. It's already stored in their brain. So I say start with the Heidelberg and catechize them at the age 4 or 3 if you can do it, with the Heidelberg Catechism. No, they're not going to fully grasp everything, but guess what? It'll be there for you to explain and tease out as they grow later and later in life. So there's just some kind of tips for parents and how I've kind of gotten into the practice of it.
Excellent. Well, as you surely know, if you're listening to this, that we are in a time in the church in the West where things are not looking great. We have been, we've seen entire generations been leaving the church, and we see this in study after study showing that the Christian young people are not remaining in the church in which they grew up. And we're also living in a time where catechesis has been on the wane. And so clearly we need to change course. What better way to change course than to recover an old practice? One helpful resource is this book called Rediscovering Catechism by Donald Van Dyke. Another helpful resource that Brandon has also mentioned is the Heidelberg Catechism. And we want to help equip you as parents to think about this. And so we invite you to come to the conference called Nurture August 27th, that's a Friday evening, over at the Green Township Senior Center. That's 3620 Epley Lane. There'll be some instructions on the show notes page on our church's website as well. But please come and join us, because the world is prepared to teach your children. And so we want to encourage you also to be prepared to disciple them in the things of Christ, in order that they do not follow the trend of young Christians in our day, but rather that they remain in the church and confess Jesus Christ from birth to the grave. Thanks so much for being with us today. This has been the Cincy Reformed Podcast. Thanks to Brandon for sharing this with us, and we look forward to hearing more of his talk at the upcoming Nurture Conference. Again, August 27th. This is the Cincy Reformed Podcast, sponsored by Westside Reformed Church. Thanks so much for being with us. Bye-bye.